Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm head of Blue Stack Productions, the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. And I'm here today in Dublin with Cillian Lohan. Cillian, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Bob.
Cillian, would you tell the audience, you're the Chief Executive Officer for the Irish Natural Forestry Foundation, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you give the audience just a sense of what we'll call the INFF for initials, what it is and what it does?
Yeah, sure. The INFF is an environmental non-government organisation. So we're one of a number of NGOs operating in that sector throughout Ireland. And we were founded initially, as the name suggests, to work within the forestry sector.
Mm-hmm.
So our founder purchased, Ian Wright, purchased some land, wanted to plant some trees on it, wanted to plant native Irish trees and a mix of different broadleaf trees. And he applied for a grant which was available to landowners to encourage them to plant forestry.
Mm-hmm.
He then found that the stipulations that came with that grant were that he had to plant a specific species of tree in a large monoculture rather than mixing them up. So his frustration with that led him to challenge the policies that were behind it. Mm-hmm. And ultimately to establish, with the support of the community and lots of people who got behind him in the early days, around 2002, to found an organisation with the explicit aim of challenging forestry policy in Ireland.
Now, what was the species that the government wanted planted?
It was a Christmas tree-like tree called Sitka spruce, so a non-native conifer. And
that's those huge plantation ones he's all over the countryside from the government. And and that policy was in the mid-90s or so that was developed?
Yeah, so Ireland suffered from a very low starting point in terms of tree cover. Mm-hmm. So we were down to 2% of the land area had trees on it. Mm-hmm. And the average across mainland Europe is around 30%, between 29 and 32%. So we developed a strategy, and rightly so, to work out how we're going to get from 2% up to more like 20% or 30%. And that strategy was called Growing for the Future. It was a government policy that was put together. And I mean, obviously it's quite a complex story, but to try and explain it to your audience, the government established a forestry company called Quilta, and the shareholders of that company were the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Agriculture. So that was established, and they were given large tracts of land, became the largest landowner in the country, and they were told, you get planting, get trees in the ground. Meanwhile, we had financial support from Europe, our old friends in Europe, to help fund getting the trees planted. And so we were getting this grant money in, and the government was getting this grant money in. It was giving it to Quilta, who were planting the trees, and we were getting our percentage cover up. That all sounds quite good. Or the issue that we have with that is that they were planting these monocultures of a non-native species because it grew very quickly. And right from the start, there wasn't enough work done to establish what's the best species mix to start planting here to get the best return. But the model that was established through government policy and through the state forestry company was to plant large monocultures of Sitka, designed to be clear-felled, which means they're all planted at the same time. They grow together. They grow quite quickly in this climate, and then they're all felled together. So you go from a plantation on the side of a hill to nothing within the matter of a week when the harvesters come in to harvest them. And this practice across Europe, on mainland Europe, you have maybe 2 or 3 acres that are typically clear-felled. We clear-fell 40 or 50 hectares here even, so.
And was the original plan to then replant all those?
We have forest policy on the one hand, which is the government policy, which is handed from one government to the next, which is reviewed and amended as it goes, but we still have this preoccupation with large monocultures of non-native species designed to be clear felled. And on the other hand, we have forestry law, we have the Forestry Act, and the Act requires legally that when you fell a plantation, you have to replant it within 2 years. As an organisation, we're trying to explore the fact that anecdotally we're hearing people are not replanting.
Yes.
We also had a very serious problem with storm damage last year, where we lost in the region between 8 and 9,000 hectares of trees blew down basically in the storm. That's a difficult figure to kind of quantify, but when you consider we're planting between 7,500 and 8,000 hectares of trees, more blew down than were planted basically in the storm last year. So along with trees that are being harvested and felled and potentially not being replanted, you're talking about a case where we could have a deforestation occurring within Ireland at the moment, and we're trying to we can't get clear figures on that from the Forest Service, but we're trying to see if that is actually the case. Certainly afforestation has stalled very, very significantly.
Now, could you explain to the audience what the various problems with the monoculture forest is?
There's the type of trees put in the ground. On the one hand, if you have a monoculture of anything, you have all your eggs in one basket, basically. So if a disease comes in, it's going to wipe through all of them. There's no resilience within that system. Nature doesn't make monocultures, and all of our engineering is designed on nature. The most robust resilient systems are complex and multi-layered. So when you put all your eggs in one basket in one species, you reduce the resilience of your forest reserve. So that's one thing about just putting a monoculture of any type in. And I would emphasize that people think we're all about planting oak trees. You know, monocultures of oaks are as bad as a monoculture of Sitka spruce. So the monoculture is a very significant part of the problem. At the moment, we're trying to use our plantations as carbon capture sinks. Because as a tree grows, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere in the form of CO2 and stores it in the wood as it's growing. We are trying to say that the emissions that we're making as a country in terms of our global climate change impact, or contribution to global climate change emissions, we're saying that these emissions are being offset in part by our forests. Again, when you have a monoculture that is prone to disease, and we have some significant disease problems within the forests in the country, there's a threat of them being of all of your climate change storage, your carbon storage units being wiped out. There are issues around where these monocultures are planted, the type of soil they're planted on, and some papers suggest that when you plant on peat soils, for example, you release more carbon into the atmosphere, more greenhouse gases than you actually sequester from the tree in the first place. There's
because you're disturbing the peat? Because
you're disturbing the peat, you plant and you're releasing these
methane.
And of course methane has a much higher warming effect in the upper atmosphere than actual carbon does. So you then get when you clear fell these plantations, if there's an effect on the water courses that are nearby, so you get heavy rains coming, you get maybe peaty soils running off into nearby streams. We challenged the State Forestry Company in the fact that they were getting these grants from Europe, and we took a legal case against them. To say that this money that was coming into the Irish government was designed to facilitate farmers to move from crop production or from food production into forestry. It was to facilitate their diversification.
Uh-huh.
Instead, we felt it was being siloed off to a state forestry company.
Okay.
The counter argument was that the state forestry company said it was a private company with a commercial remit,
Uh-huh.
and so it was entitled to these just as much as anyone else was.
Uh-huh.
The court finding was that wasn't the case.
Uh-huh.
And since then, and this was confirmed in a joint Oireachtas, one of these parliamentary hearing committees
Uh-huh.
last year from Quilta themselves, the state forestry company, they don't plant trees anymore, which
No.
I think is quite shocking for a forestry company. So they're replanting some of the stuff they're felling, but they don't have an afforestation program.
Uh-huh.
So they don't have an active program of going out and planting trees.
Uh-huh.
They do have a commercial program where they've expanded and bought sawmills, and they've bought production facilities, and they've expanded the business into other areas.
Uh-huh.
But there's a failure in the tree planting when, if we go back to the start of the story and our ambition to increase that tree cover, we've gone from 2% up to about 11% at the moment. So we haven't increased the number of trees
Uh-huh.
in the ground, but quite often the wrong species planted in monocultures.
Now, and the spot where you're located is now, is it the estate in Cork? The Mancha estate?
Yes, so the Mancha estate is a privately owned estate, a very historical estate owned by the Connor family.
Uh-huh.
And our founder, Ian Wright, went in there with an idea to use that as a model
Uh-huh.
for an alternative to these large monocultures. So one of the things as an organisation that's always been at the heart of our ethos is not to criticise anything unless you can offer an alternative.
Mhm.
And what we try to do is say, okay, we think monocultures of non-native species designed for clearfell is not the correct model for this country to progress.
Mhm.
Here's what we think we should be doing instead, and that's mixed species, native species, native provenance, which I'll talk about in a second, but native provenance species,
Uh-huh.
and mix them together and have manage them under a system called continuous cover forest, where you're selectively felling trees and you always have a forest, so you never have this massive scar on the side of the land.
Mhm.
The benefits to biodiversity are multiple, the
Mm.
benefits to groundwater, to the health of the soil and so on. So
Mm.
it's multi-beneficial, and also there are social benefits to people who live near these types of forests. A
Mhm.
walk through a mixed broadleaf woodland is a completely different experience than walking through rows and rows of a plantation, which isn't really a forest, it's a commercial plantation. So we wanted to kind of put the forests back into forestry. On the one hand, our policy is, as an organisation, is to always try and offer a solution. The other thing that we try and do is work with the people, work as close as we can with the people who we're fighting against.
Mhm.
And so the Forest Service came on board with us, who are part of the Department of Agriculture, the police force for forestry in Ireland,
Mhm.
and they offered us funding in order to establish these trials
Oh.
at the Manch.
So now maybe that'll lead us into the kind of three components of the program, as it's the education, research, and advocacy. And I wonder if you could kind of just briefly describe each of those
Sure.
components.
Well, we at INFF we had an identity problem when I joined in 2010. The estate and that project, that Manch project, was so well known throughout the country and locally that there was the term INFF and the Manch project were used, they were indistinguishable from each other. And so part of my job was to try and tease that apart. And so what we established for the organisation, working with the board, was that we have, to help our own identity, was that we have three distinct departments. So my job is identifying those departments and running them and overseeing their operation. And those are education, policy and projects. And our education our education program is one where we take students and from kindergarten level right up to university level, and everything in between, and they visit us at our education centre, and we do outdoor education activities with them on ecology, on we do curriculum linked work, linked to the national curriculum, and we do non-curriculum work. So we give lectures on different university topics. People are studying ecology or environmental science or environmental policy or forestry or permaculture, quite a variety of things. And then we also do, the younger kids come in and we do bug hunts up in the woods, or we go and we do artwork in the forest with them, or we go and do pond dips in the pond where we're looking at invertebrate life in the pond.
What's the staffing you have at the INF?
For the education program, we have one education manager, and then Nikki, she utilises 2 part-time staff depending on the number of groups that come in as teaching assistants and assistants with maybe the different bits of admin that are required for it. Then on our, and she's like that wouldn't function without Nikki. Our policy work, it was founded, I guess, on the foundation of the organisation being trying to change forestry policy. We had this diagram that we had for a while on the wall, which was a tree, and we were trying to work out our identity. And we had this tree which represented the organisation. On the trunk we had INFF, and then all of the branches were. One branch was biodiversity, and another branch was economics, and another branch was agriculture, and another branch was freshwater ecology. And so we found that you can't, and we had the roots going down into the ground, the roots were soil quality. And when we started working forestry policy, we couldn't help but get involved in planning issues on the rivers that were being affected by forestry decisions. We follow the river down to the coast, and then we're working with coastal groups on coastal issues. We got involved in farming because forestry is so caught up with in the Department of Agriculture. We couldn't work on forestry without working with farmers and the issues they were involved in, and what is a tree and what is not a tree, and where does scrubland fit into the forestry program. And we've got that whole history of the work that Ian had done. And the other people he had worked with, Tony Lowes, who's now Friends of the Irish Environment, had worked very closely, Tony and Caroline, with Ian at the start in establishing the organisation and challenging what felt unchallengeable at the time. So I've taken that now and brought it to kind of the next level in terms of broadening out into working in other areas, which is behind our rebranding of the organisation, which I know we're going to talk about in a second.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But let's switch to advocacy, research, which is the other component. Then we'll come back to that rebranding.
Well, research is one of the projects area. So our projects, our third component is the projects work, and that involves research either on the estate at Manch again, or it can involve just desktop research, which we do a lot of as well, which is not based on the estate, that can be based elsewhere. We have a tree planting project where we try to replicate the planting that we did on the Manch estate on other sites around the country. We had a project on the role of ponds in biodiversity, for example, which was a desktop study to try and influence common agriculture policy, so that we could include ponds on farms and see what kind of added value they had in terms of climate change mitigation and in terms of improving biodiversity on farms. Our most ambitious project in recent times was the 1 million trees in one day, which has its own website. If a project gets big enough, it kind of has its own presence. And Imogen Raybone came to us with this. It was her concept to plant 1 million trees, and she had tried a number of different organisations to support her, and I think most of them told her she was mad, and told her, however, go and visit these guys in West Cork. So she came to see us, and immediately Ian and I said, this is a fantastic idea, and got behind her on it.
Okay. Now, just before we get to this this last issue on the rebranding and how this is all kind of stretching out, you're also working. You've been the appointee to the European Economic and Social Committee.
Correct.
And what does that involve? You were nominated by the Environmental Pillar. to the government,
Yeah.
and the government then appointed you to this. And what work is involved with that
Okay. Well,
committee,
that's
the European Committee?
Yeah, that's a really interesting area, and that kind of for my own organisation that falls in the policy. So that's kind of which area that fits into. And within Europe, there are the three big institutions that everybody knows. There's the European Commission, there's the European Parliament, and then there's the European Council. And within these three institutions, or between them, there sits another group called the European Economic and Social Committee, and it's made up of representatives of civil society. And the ambition for it was to be a voice for civil society. So you have the Commission, who are all appointed by national governments. You have the Parliament, who are all elected by member states, by the electorate within member states, and then you have the council, which are all the heads of state or the heads of, or the governments of Europe meeting together. And so this committee was to bridge the gap, and our role is to input into legislation as it's formed there, and directives. So any directive needs to start within these institutions in Europe at the Commission. And they send a communication to the Parliament. It's the first step. But all of those communications come through our committee first of all. So they get sent to us, and then we write we debate and agree and vote upon what is ultimately called an opinion. So we have our opinion on the communication from the Commission, and that gets attached to the communication before it goes to the Parliament. And we're appointed. So all of the member states are represented on the committee, and Ireland appoints 9 people to it. And so the Irish government makes a nomination of 9 experts in different areas that they put forward for it. And 5 years ago, the environmental pillar were invited by the then government to propose somebody to go forward to be on this committee. They took a seat from one of the farming groups, and they said, there's 2 farming seats, we're going to give one of those seats to the environmental sector. Coincidentally, or otherwise, the Green Party were in government at the time, and so we have them to thank for getting an environmental voice out there.
And yet another reason for the farming community to hate the environmental groups.
Absolutely.
Now you described that tree in your office, okay? And obviously it's now an old growth tree, and you've got roots going out all over the place. And where has that led you to? You've talked about a rebranding of the INF, and why don't you tell the audience what that is and what's happening with it?
Well, I found that when I introduced myself as the CEO of INFF, first of all, it's not particularly catchy, a bit of a mouthful to say. But
when was that? When did you join INFF?
Oh, in 2010.
2010, okay.
So when I'd say I'm CEO of the Irish Natural Forestry Foundation, and people are obviously grasping to try and put you in a context, they say, okay, forestry, he's a forestry guy. And then I may go on to talk about one of the branches or one of the roots that we're working on. So sometimes it's not that far-fetched for a forestry guy to be talking about soil or a need for a soil directive, or it's not that far-fetched to be talking about air quality. But maybe when I start talking about different forms of sustainable food production, an eyebrow might raise, because they say, well, why is the forestry guy talking about food production? And certainly if we go into the area of economics and job creation, it raises maybe 2 eyebrows. And so the name of the organisation no longer reflected the variety of work and the variety of expertise that we had gained as an organisation. So when we sat down with the board and talked about how this broadening needed to be represented by the overall image of us as an NGO, we realised that everything was connected to the term green economy.
Right.
So all of this led us to looking at how we make each of the policy areas we're working in into viable alternatives to what we're challenging. And so we latched onto this idea of the green economy, greening the economies, which is happening all over the world, and an expression that's been used widely. And so we found that each of our policy areas we were working in, and each of our project areas, what we were trying to demonstrate in our projects, and what we were preaching and teaching in our education programs, all linked together under the green economy, or thus our rebranding as the Green Economy Foundation.
It's going to be called the Green Economy Foundation.
So that's going to be our name, yes.
And when what do you anticipate relaunching the organization?
Our relaunch should happen by the end of 2015. So December 2015. That's what we're looking at.
That's
having our website up and running, and having our new logo out there. And we'll never lose where we came from.
Right.
We'll never forget INFF. Will still be there, existing, and will is a very prominent part of how we came to be. And that Manch project is a legacy, in particular, as the flagship project of the organisation, that will go on for generations, and has transformed that landscape. That's a 320-acre estate that has a fantastic, especially after the thinning that's just been completed. It has this fantastic heritage now of a mixed woodland. I mean, it's beautiful when you see it. And it's a lovely area to walk through, and it's providing an income that it's paying for itself. So those things will always be there. With the Green Economy Foundation now is a stronger representation of where we're going as an organisation.
Terrific, and we'll look forward to seeing that in December. And thanks for talking with us today.
Yeah, well, thanks for giving me the platform to speak about it.
Good luck to it.